سأبدأ الحديث بالعربية. لا بس اسم الايفنت. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. My name is Sultan Barakat. I'm the director of the Center for Conflict Studies and Humanitarian Work in Doha. It's my pleasure to open this webinar dedicated to launching our first report entitled Conflict Trends in the Arab World. It's become necessary really due to the way events have been turning to prepare such a report. This is part of a bigger effort by our center pertaining to issues relating to conflicts and humanitarian work. We will be discussing conflict trends in the period between 1946 and 2019, and we compare that to the regional and international trends. This report comes out through our collaboration with Oslo in Peace Research Institute or Center, and I would like to avail myself of this opportunity to acknowledge our partnership with this center in Oslo, which started almost at the same time when we started our own center in 2016, and we've been collaborating over many issues and the thinking over ways of I would like to thank Dr. Henrik Ordell. He will be speaking on behalf of the Institute. We use the term Arab world to distinguish it from the Middle East or MENA, the Middle East and North Africa, because this would enable us to have a perspective focusing on the interests on the area through many decades of colonial rule and competition between East and West in the Cold War. And it's we find it a term which is more suitable. It provides us really more space to deal with this region in particular, with all its natural resources and the conflicts it has been witnessing, and the impact of this region on international peace and security, and through the common factors of language, culture, religion, etc. And also some of these aspects have been dealt with in other studies made by the Arab Center, and which shows some of the surveys conducted by the Arab Center show that a reasonable majority of the inhabitants of this region consider the region as one when it comes to language and culture, and the importance of this region really is apparent when we discuss and dismantle the problems and the conflicts and deal with them in detail and with the proper analysis in order to reach a more comprehensive look. And we also contained Uppsala University's Uppsala University database, the main source for the statistics and figures and the report covers three types of political violence: violence in state-based conflicts, and the non-state conflicts, and also the one-sided violence. And I would like to welcome Professor Peter Wallenstein today. He will be also commenting today, and he is from Uppsala University. And we'd like also to welcome Dr. Marwan Qabalan from the Arab Center. He is a colleague with long-standing expertise in the Arab world. And through this report, we want to establish a launching pad for discussion between the Arab world and the world at large, and we welcome any alternative views to the views expressed in this report, and we plan to make it the first in a long series of similar studies to discuss the affairs of the Arab world, linking data pertaining to conflicts with humanitarian and other aspects of life and conflicts. And the aim is to reach a more comprehensive and a deeper view. And I must not forget to express our gratitude. Our other colleagues, Dr. Siri Rasted from PRIO and Dr. Samson Milton and other colleagues. They will also be presenting after my presentation. They will be presenting some of the conclusions. We will start with Sari will be speaking about the global aspects, and the other colleagues will talk about the Arab world. But please allow me to welcome Dr. Henrik first to give his opening remarks on behalf of the Oslo Center. Then I'll come back to moderating this session. Professor Henrik Ordell, he's a political scientist from Norway and the current director of the Oslo Center Institute. Before his appointment in 2017, he was director of research at the same center and for many years, and he was the executive chief editor-in-chief of the Journal of Peace Studies, which is one of the most important academic journals in this field. I'd like to welcome now Professor Henrik.
Ladies and gentlemen, friends and colleagues, it's my great pleasure to be able to extend some welcoming words to you all on the occasion of the launch of this new report on conflict trends in the Arab world, 1946 to 2019, jointly authored by researchers at the Center for Conflict and Humanitarian Studies and PRIO. Congratulations to the authors for undertaking what has become a hallmark report documenting conflict in the Arab world. Many thanks are due to our good and valued colleagues at the Center for Conflict and Humanitarian Studies and its director, Sultan Barakat. The CHS and PRIO have a great history of collaboration going far back, and it has, as ever, been rewarding and worthwhile working with you on this report. We look forward to our continued partnership and our joint projects in the future. I would further like to acknowledge the contribution of another longtime PRIO collaborator, the Department of Peace and Conflict Research at the University of Uppsala, which is the provider of the data that the report is based on. The Uppsala Conflict Data Program has for decades provided the most trusted, high quality, and transparent conflict data that is available anywhere, being widely used by academic and policy communities alike. And I'm very pleased that Senior Professor Peter Wallenstein, who established the UCDP, is with us here today to discuss the report. My warmest thanks also to Marwan Kabalan, researcher and director of the policy analysis at the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies, for agreeing to comment on the report and contribute to the discussion. PRIO is one of the world's leading institutions in the field of peace research and has for over 6 decades conducted cutting-edge research on the conditions, causes, and dynamics of peace, conflict, security, and violence. PRIO is home to a disciplinary and methodologically diverse research community, bringing innovative social science approaches to bear on issues from migration to ceasefires, drones to disarmament, mass mobilization to mediation. And we are dedicated to producing world-leading high-quality research. But central to our mandate is that this is also of great political and societal relevance and importance. And our ambition is to build high quality and evidence-based policy advice that has the transformative power to make a difference in the world, what we refer to as engaged excellence. And the report on Arab conflict trends is responding directly to this ambition. Documenting and disaggregating the rise in armed conflicts in the region over the past decades is a prerequisite for understanding their causes and dynamics, let alone addressing and identifying the possible solutions. I'm thus exceptionally pleased to see this impressive report completed and launched, and I look forward to the important debates that it will most certainly trigger. Thank you so much and enjoy the launch.
Thank you so much, Henrik. We'll move now to our colleagues who are going to try and explore some of the findings of this report. And we're going to start with Samson Milton and Muna Hidayah from the Center for Conflict and Humanitarian Studies, discussing some of the data that's represented on the Arab world. And then our colleague from PRIO, Siri Rusted, will speak to the international trends and how it compares to the Arab world. Siri Rusted is a senior researcher at PRIO, and I'm very grateful for her for having stuck with us on this. We discussed this many years ago, the idea, and she has kept the belief that it is possible, and I'm very, very grateful for the hard work she put into this. Samson Milton as well has been involved in this for a long time and provided a lot of critical analysis and insights onto the discussions around the Arab world. But to my mind, I think the rising star in our center here, and I hope maybe internationally in due course, is Muna Hidayah. She is a young researcher at the Arab Center who has been dedicating a lot of time to the work related to this report. So without further ado, I ask Muna and Sam to start their presentation.
شكرا جزيلا دكتور سلطان لهذه الكلمات اللطيفة.
Thank you, Dr. Sultan, for your kind words, and my thanks also to Dr. Henrik for all his support for this unique project. And I would like to thank also our attendees and followers. Despite my love for the Arabic language, please allow me to speak in English for this event.
تظهر لديكم
Do you see my slides? Is the PowerPoint?
Yes, go ahead, Muna.
Okay. In this short presentation, we are not intending to present the findings through the whole report. Rather than that, we are going to shed light on some selected prominent or interesting key findings from different report sections. We will start first with the key findings from the Arab World Trends Analysis. And this first figure we present here shows the state-based conflict trends in the Arab countries between 1946 and 2019. In the figure, we can see that, in general, the conflict level in the Arab world is fairly stable. Nevertheless, there are two outstanding periods in terms of conflict intense, which is the battle death rate. The first period between 1980 and 1988, the high double spikes there of battle deaths were caused by the Iran-Iraq war, which accounted for 70% of battle deaths in that period in the region. The second period that stands out begins in 2011 and continues until the present. And we refer to this period in the report as post-Arab Spring era. The year 2014 in this period recorded the highest number of state-based conflicts in the Arab region since the end of World War II. This mainly due to the conflict in Syria. Actually, the number of conflicts in this era is nearly double the number of conflicts in the previous period starting in 2001, and more interestingly, while the high number of conflicts in this period is sustained until 2019, the number of battle deaths decreases over the same time period. From the same figure, in terms of conflict subtypes, we see an interstate conflicts concentration between 1948 and 1991. During the period from 1948 to 1973, this was primarily populated by the Arab-Israeli conflicts that emerged in face of occupation. However, these wars are not classified in UCDP under a special type, as the case with wars of the colonial period, which we believe as authors that it doesn't capture the complex dynamics of wars related to occupation and colonialism that continue to affect Palestine and other sites in the region until now. Now, by splitting the state-based conflicts during the reports period between conflicts where 25 to 999 killed in a calendar year and wars where 1,000 or more killed in a calendar year, one of the key results we find is that the Arab world witnessed a rise in the number of wars, the likes of which hadn't been experienced since the end of the Cold War. We can notice here also that non-war conflicts, while numerous, are still low intensity, even when considered in total. In this figure, we split the number of countries, we show the number of countries with conflicts versus the number of conflicts in the Arab world. The number of conflicts and conflict countries in the region are approximately the same until 2012. After 2012, we see that the number of conflicts, comparing, of course, to conflict countries, increases substantially due primarily and in terms of qualitative data to the spread of IS into the conflict dynamics of other countries. However, overall, the multiplicity of conflict in Arab countries in this period can be linked to some groups' exploitation of existing violent conflicts that had erupted over historical grievances between groups, struggles for power and regime control, and or the decline of state control in these countries. In this figure, we show the number of civil wars in Arab countries by international involvement. Also, one of the prominent findings here is the increasing number of internationalized civil conflicts. While many conflicts are intrastate, we see an increasing trend for third-party involvement. This trend is mostly clear in 2019, which witnessed 7 internationalized conflicts in the Arab world. And that is the largest number since the end of World War II. And you can see it clearly through the figure. Now, in this figure, we split the conflicts again by incompatibility to territorial conflicts, governmental conflicts, and mixed conflicts. The total number of territorial conflicts and governmental conflicts in the Arab world during the covered period is very similar. However, a notable increase can be spotted in governmental conflicts in the region since the 1980s, which is a unique trend for the region, by the way. As the case of other similar trends, the report tries to offer some explanations for this. Still, land retains special importance, and we think it is possible to anticipate an increase in the rate of territorial conflicts in the forthcoming period, unfortunately. Now, exploring the trends of non-state conflicts in the region, we see that the level of them was fairly stable until 1989, averaging approximately 10 conflicts per year. This was the case until 2014, when the number jumped to 50 and then swiftly declined again to 17 by 2019, which is also greater than the average, as you can see. The main increase can be attributed to conflicts in Syria, which are accounted for over 80% of the region battle deaths in 2018 and 2019, and note that these years are not the years that witnessed the highest battle deaths in Syria, unfortunately again. Furthermore, we see a sizable share of non-state conflicts in Libya, Sudan, and Yemen. And let me here finally point out that there is a clear overlap between the most prominent countries that have witnessed state-based conflicts and those that have experienced non-state conflicts. And now my colleague Sam Milton will continue to present the results through the rest of the Arab world slides. So here are you, Sam. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mona. Could you stop sharing the screen so I can share from here, please?
Yeah. Did it stop?
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
So to begin, we looked at one-sided violence in the Arab world between 1989 and 2019. And the highest peak of the one-sided violence in the Arab world was in the 2000s, which we found to be tied to a range of perpetrators in Sudan and in Iraq, and also the second intifada in Palestine. During this period, most perpetrators of one-sided violence were non-state actors. Yet from 2011, there was a peak in government-perpetrated violence linked generally to the various conflicts of the Arab Spring. Whilst the number of perpetrators from 2011 onwards is not lower than the levels in the 2000s, the number of people killed was much higher. We also see a substantial decrease in both types of one-sided violence in 2019. Whilst this may give some optimism about the near future, it could also mean that governments have eliminated and suppressed dissent, and that several countries have turned towards more authoritarian regimes. The report suggests that the UCDP's data is accurate with regards to one-sided violence when reliable information is available. Clear-cut cases include the Rabaa Square massacre of over 1,000 civilian protesters by Egyptian security forces in 2013, or the killing of over 100 protesters in Khartoum by the new incumbent government in Sudan after the revolution in April 2019, with the massacre in June 2019. Yet in cases of asymmetrical conflict, such as in the global war on terror in places such as Somalia or Afghanistan, these statistics are less accurate and less reliable. sources are a lot more conflicted and controversial. The UCDP defines one-sided violence as the use of armed force by the government of a state or by a formally organized group against civilians, which results in at least 25 deaths, excluding extrajudicial killings. Whilst our report depends on this data set as an indicator, it's important to note that it only counts direct and intentional killing. Given this, we analyse in the report several potential examples in the Arab world that are not coded in the data set, in particular in the past 10 years. The most significant case is that of Iraq, where widespread reports of attacks on civilians, in particular in the intense sectarian violence of 2005 to 2008. I think many of us recall many instances of bombings of buses and markets, civilians, in many cases where there were clear civilian targets, yet there was no proof of intentionality and no ability to locate one single perpetrator in a very chaotic, multi-actor environment with many, many different threats and sources of violence. There was very low accountability, very little rule of law, and there was much of the evidence was contested for attributing claims for one-sided violence. So in the data set, there's very low recorded instances of one-sided violence during this period in Iraq, yet from the common sense from the region, we should be observing extremely high numbers of one-sided violence, in particular in that period of the post-invasion chaos in Iraq. So even more controversially, we could say that there's a widely held perception in the Arab world that at least some of what is categorized as indiscriminate violence in military operations is, in fact, more akin to one-sided violence targeted at civilians. The report in particular considers the case of Gaza, where indiscriminate killings of civilians during the Great March of Return was considered one-sided violence, but not in the 4 asymmetric wars carried out on the Gaza Strip since 2008, most recently this year. So moving on now to the geographic spread of conflict. We can see regarding the geographic spread of conflict in the Arab region, there's much in-country variation within conflict-affected countries in the Arab world, where even the most severe conflicts, including Iraq, Syria, and Yemen, all have relatively secure and stable regions in comparison to the conflict hotspots within those countries. Furthermore, this map also shows that there are conflict events occurring in countries that were not considered conflict countries in 2019, such as Sudan and Algeria, suggesting that these conflicts were of low intensity, registering less than 25 battle deaths in any calendar year. Yet nonetheless, this means that these countries should be followed closely to monitor further developments, in particular, seeing as both of those countries are in a transitional period. In Sudan, we see a limited number of state-based and non-state conflict events, but a significant level of one-sided violence. Most of these latter events entailed violence from the government of Sudan towards civilians, which is a concerning trend for the country's democratic transition. In terms of conflict termination, the data shows that approximately 1 to 2 conflicts end each year in the Arab world. From 1946 to 2013, most of these conflicts ended with a victory for the government, or side A, while a few ended with victory for side B, or an insurgent or rebel group, or in the cases of interstate conflict, another state. In the same time period, approximately 38% of terminated conflicts ended in a settlement by either a peace agreement or a ceasefire. More interestingly, civil wars in the Arab world are most likely to end by low activity for other conflicts, but not for internationalized civil wars. Governmental conflicts are much more likely to end with a victory for the government, whilst territorial conflicts are more likely to end with settlements. We can also see that interstate conflicts were more often resolved through a ceasefire than a peace agreement. This is best explained as a result of the Arab-Israeli conflict, that was managed through treaties signed between Israel and Egypt and Jordan respectively, rather than through generalized peace agreements. And now I'd like to hand over to Dr. Siri to present on the significance of the global trends in terms of its relation and significance to the Arab world.
So thank you, Samson and Mona, for the presentation of the Arab world. And I'll try to give you an overview of how this fits into the general global trends. I'm just going to share my screen, and let's see if I can do this. Okay, I hope you see my presentation now. Okay, can you see it? Yeah. Okay, so I thought I'd just start off with some facts and stats from what it looks like in 2019 on the state-based conflict. So conflict where the state is one of the actors. So we had 54 state-based conflicts in 2019, overall 37 countries, meaning that one country can actually have several conflicts because the state will be fighting different non-state actors. 47 of these conflicts were conflicts, so less than 1,000 killed, and 7 were wars. In total, globally, there were 51,000 people killed in what we call battle-related deaths. These do not include the indirect deaths. And also Afghanistan was the most violent conflict in this period. So when you look at this graph over time, there are 4 points that I would like to point out. And the first is this increase up until the early 1990s. And there are 2 reasons why we see this increase. The first is, of course, that we had a breakdown on the Soviet Union in the early 1990s, and there are a lot of internal conflicts around this. The second is that during this period before the breakdown, a lot of conflicts around the world were supported by the superpowers. When the Soviet Union broke down, a lot of the financing dried up and conflicts were not able to sustain. And that's why we see this decline also after the early 1990s. The second trend is that we see in this period, there's an increase of conflict, but it's also increase in civil conflicts, so civil wars, and very few international wars. What we also see towards the end here, and which was mentioned earlier as a trend in the Arab world as well, is that we see an increase of internationalized conflicts, civil wars, which is when a third-party state is supporting one of the 2 actors involved in the civil war, and in most cases this would be the state in the conflict. There are a few exceptions of this. For example, the Ukraine civil war, where Russia is supporting the rebel groups in the eastern parts of Ukraine. The black line signifies the battle deaths. And what we see that it has been a decline over the past years, and we do see some spikes, but most of these spikes can be contributed to specific conflicts. So this one in the early 2000s is related to the war between Ethiopia and Eritrea. We have a small one here, which is the end of the war in Sri Lanka, and then the larger one here, which is the Syrian conflict. And then we see it has decreased over the past 5 years. The bar at the bottom of this page shows the breakdown of battle deaths for 2019. The blue shaded countries are the Arab world countries, so that you can see sort of the split between the Arab world and the rest of the world here. But the most important and significant is, of course, that we see Afghanistan has the largest share of battle deaths. More than 50% of all people killed in conflict in the world in 2019 were in Afghanistan. The last trend I wanted to mention is what was also mentioned a little bit earlier, is the rise, this spike we see here, which is related to IS conflict. So I've broken this down a little bit further, and in this graph here, we see that the orange area shows conflicts that do not have IS as a actor, while the gray area are IS-related conflicts. And in 2019, 16 conflicts were IS-related. This is 30% of all conflicts that were going on in the world. And if you look at the graph, if it hadn't been for the IS conflicts, the conflict level would actually have been quite stable. On the other hand, we see that only 10% of the battle deaths are related to these conflicts. So the map on the bottom here, I wanted to show a little bit sort of the spread of these conflicts as well. And Mona also mentioned that IS get involved in the conflict dynamics of other conflicts. So most of the time they get involved in already conflict areas. So while IS conflict started in the Syria and Iraq conflict area in the Arab world, it has spread to a much larger extent. There is a stronghold in the western part of Africa, particularly around the Lake Chad. But we also have IS conflicts in Asia, such as the Philippines. There are also, while not in 2019, in Bangladesh, Pakistan. We also see in Africa, south of Sahel, Mozambique, and also in 2020, IS were causing the first ever recorded civil war in Tanzania, or after 1946, that is. Okay, so as was also mentioned earlier, that we do have different types of conflicts. So also looking a little bit closer at the non-state conflicts, because these are an increasing concern on a global level. So this graph breaks down number of non-state conflicts by region. And we do see that the Arab region has had the largest share over the past 5-6 years, which is, as was mentioned, due to Syria. But we have also seen a large increase in the non-Arab Africa area. The two black lines here shows the increase of, or the battle deaths broken down by non-Arab countries and Arab countries. And we see the dotted line, which are the Arab countries. The level of non-state battle deaths was very high and was the highest among the regions. But we also see that in the past 2 years, there's been an increase in the non-Arab world and has surpassed the Arab world by far. Part of this are due to drug-related conflicts in the Americas, particularly in Mexico. We also further break down non-state conflicts to different types of conflicts. It's a very varied type of conflict. So we have 3 types. The formally organized groups, which are groups that they have a name, some have a website, they have an organization. This is the most common, and we had in 2019, 38 of these. Then we have a smaller group called informally organized groups, supporter groups, which are often related to elections, and there's only one of these in 2019. And then finally, community conflicts. These are less organized groups, often related to ethnicity, clans, etc. Could be nomad farmers conflicts. And this is the second largest, 28 conflicts in 2019. This bottom graph breaks down the battle deaths related to the various types of non-state conflicts. And we see by far that the formally organized groups have the highest share. The community conflicts only have 10% of the same rate of death, which means that the organized groups are organized non-state conflicts are a much violent type of conflicts. As was mentioned earlier, it is this former type that we see most of in the Arab world, very few of the others, in fact, while in a lot of the non-Arab African countries, we do see a lot of community violence. I wanted to show you a little bit about the geographic spread. So this is the entire world, except that I only focus in on Africa and the Arab world to be able to actually show the different colors. And this includes all types of events. So the dots represents places where we actually have seen conflict events happening. And what is interesting here is that we see that there are the same countries that have the three types of violence. It's not exclusively like that, but mostly. But what is interesting, and which the map doesn't show, is the dynamic, how these work together. And we often see that the non-state conflicts comes in the shadow of a state-based violence. And I think Syria is a very good example of this, where you had very few non-state conflicts before the Syrian war started. But then a couple of years after the war started, we saw a large increase, and it was up to 30, 40, 50 non-state conflicts during the civil war. And part of the reason why we see this type of dynamic is that it creates opportunity. The state is busy with other things. There are competition between different non-state groups during the conflict, and it could also be splinters. So non-state groups having disagreements and splitting up and then fighting. But this is an area that needs more research. Finally, I wanted to give you a glimpse into what the trends look like for 2020. And the main message here is that it's very stable. It doesn't change a lot from the 2019 trends. So we have 56 state-based conflicts, which is the overall highest level ever since 1946. In 37 countries, 48 conflicts, 8 wars, we have 49,000 battle deaths. So it's decreasing, but only with a couple of thousand compared to 2019. Afghanistan is still the most violent conflict, but as you can see from the graph below, the level of violence has decreased quite a lot in Afghanistan from 2019 to 2020, with approximately 1/3. Africa is still the continent with the highest level of conflicts. Maybe one different thing that we didn't expect from 2019 to 2020 is this war in Azerbaijan, which then turned out to be the second most violent conflict in the world in 2020, which started abruptly in the fall of 2020 and killed more than 7,500 people. Thank you. This was my overview over the global scene, and I'm looking forward to hearing the discussion.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Siri. Thank you, Muna. Thank you, Sam. I think what Siri, Muna, and Sam has given is just a glimpse of what is in the 50+ pages of the report. So I encourage you to go to either PRIO's website or our website at chs-doha.org and download the report. You can download it in PDF free of charge. Few points that I'd like to raise before we move on to the more critical stage of reviewing or launching this report. First, for those who ask why we stopped at 2019, is because the 2020, as Siri has said, data is just about to come out and is being processed, and it is something that wasn't available for us when we started working on this report. But as I said in my introduction, we hope that every 2 or 3 years, we will be able to get this focus. The difference between this report and other reports that have looked into the MENA is really the analytical unit. The focus on the Arab world means that you have to take certain countries out of the equation and insert others. And in our focus, of course, you see that there are a number of questions that have been raised in the report, particularly in relation to the Arab-Israeli conflict and to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict more so. And of course, the report itself, in addition to presenting the data, which is very much building on purely building on Uppsala's collected data, what it presents are the interpretations from our collective perspective. Why we think the data looks the way it does. And that is quite an important, and you can see while we were engaging in this, we have identified a number of gaps, which I hope also in the database they will be reflected upon. And we've raised a number of questions purely from the way we see it as a region. So that has been a very important exercise for us. Thank you very much to you, to the three of you. I would like now to invite Professor Peter Wallenstein. Professor Peter is a senior professor at Uppsala University, and he's been in Uppsala University, I think forever, 1985 to 2012. And he's one of the most senior professors working on the issues of conflict and peace, and was the first chair to be appointed in Uppsala as a professor for the Dag Hammarskjöld professorship, partly in recognition of the work he's done in establishing the Uppsala database. And we're extremely grateful that he has taken the time to look into this report, in addition to those who did a blind peer review to the data and the discussion that went on. Professor Wallenstein and Dr. Marwan have agreed to read it and give us a critical reflection on the value of the report and where can we move from here. So Peter, please, if you can start with your points. And I know it must be very hard for someone who set up the data to have some other people coming in suddenly trying to unpack it and look through the details. But please do bear with us. It's a learning curve for us as well. And for those who are following us on the internet, I have received a couple of questions. Please write it on the social media, and my colleagues will pass it on to me. We will have plenty of time for discussion after Peter and Marwan present their reflection on the report. And for the 80+ people who are registered for this event, you can simply either raise your electronic hand or write your question in the Q&A section. Thank you very much. Peter, over to you.
Thank you very much, Sultan, and thanks for the introduction. Yes, I came to Uppsala as a student in 1964. I never left, except when visiting Doha, of course. But thank you very much for this report. I think it is very competently done, and I'm very happy to see that the whole team that has worked on this has really looked at the definitions and understood what this is all about. And for many who have not worked in this business, it may all sound very technical what many are doing, but that's necessary because we are talking about a very politically sensitive area. So we need to have fairly technical terms in order to be able to collect the data in a proper way. So I think you have understood it, and the comments that you have are really very, very significant. And I've taken notes of some of these. So let me just highlight a couple of things which I think are really important, perhaps also for the future. One is the figure number 6, which is about the intervention and about the rise of intervention. And of course that is also taking place in the Arab world to a similar extent as in other parts, but perhaps even more. And that's the kind of questions I would like to see. I mean, is there something which is more specific for the Arab world compared to other regions? Can we identify that? And one suggestion is that this level of intervention in civil wars from outside is maybe a feature that we have seen at least now lately. Syria is, of course, an example where you also have neighbors intervening as well as regionally external actors intervening. And I think that's quite significant and very important. And it helps us explain quite a bit of why it's so difficult to deal with many of these conflicts. So in the future, I'd like to see if that is something you can expand on in your studies. There was also a very interesting graph, a presentation about the spreading of conflict and how all these three categories that we talk about, how they can relate to each other. That is definitely a theme that has not really been explored very much. Is it so that conflicts start with non-state conflicts and then go on to one-sided violence and then become armed conflicts, or are they all going together? I think this also raises really interesting questions and where the analysis can be very, very useful. For instance, Sansoum mentioned massacres of different sorts in Iraq following the US invasion. All that is really interesting to explore. And it could well be that this has not been picked up by the UCDP. And of course, this is a continuous project. We are all the time revising data when we get new information. So if you have new information, that is in itself interesting. And that would be really appreciated if you tell us more. But my point was now really about the spreading. How does these conflicts start? The idea with recording conflicts that are on a low level, minor as it's defined here, between 25 and 999, again, quite technical, but the idea is to capture smaller conflicts and see if they escalate and become big wars, or how does that happen? Or the other way around, how come that conflicts de-escalate? These kind of dynamics, I think, would really be very interesting to explore, and particularly as you have the insights here to do that with respect to the Arab world. I think that would really help us a lot. A third point is really relating to the definition of the Arab world, which I think is, I like it. I think it is a good way of trying to do it. And I agree, it's much better than talking about the Middle East. When you are in the US, for instance, the Middle East basically means Israel, Palestine, and it doesn't even mean the full Middle East. And I think it's better to find another concept. And I like the idea of looking at it in terms of the Arab world. The question is really how one defines, so to say, the outer limits of what is the Arab world. And you have chosen, I think, quite correctly, the Arab League as a way of defining who are. But maybe that's not enough. You have now used member states of the Arab League. There are also countries that would like to become members, like Eritrea and Chad. Should one think about them? But there are also significant Arab populations outside the Arab League, and they are also part of the Arab world in some sense. And I think it would be interesting to see what can one incorporate that in some way. Of course, Israel now is really quite interesting, as the present government wouldn't be in place if it didn't have support from the Arab members of the Knesset. So is Israel, so to say, becoming part of the Arab world? I think that somehow needs to be taken care of. Or you have a big 1.5 million people in Iran, which are also Arab speaking. So I'm suggesting that it would be interesting to think a little larger about the Arab world. What is it? It is more than the League of Arab States. I can just give you as a side point that since 2015, the second most common language in Sweden is Arabic, because we had this inflow of so many people primarily from Syria in 2015. So they are now several percent of the Swedish population, and they are more common than people who are speaking Finnish or Norwegian or Danish. So I start to feel that we could also be part of the Arab world in a way. But that's a side point. But it is interesting to think about alternative or additional ways of measuring what the Arab world is. And indeed, there are so many good arguments for why one should focus on the Arab world in itself. A final point, again, a little more technical perhaps, but it relates to a couple of the graphs, figure 2 and figure 8, if I remember correctly. And that's the statistics on the battle-related deaths that go back to 1946. I have two reactions here. And one is really that these are two different methodologies that have been used. So since 1989, it's basically done by the UCDP. The data 1946 to 1988 is done by a PRIO project done by Nils Petter Gleditsch. So in a sense, that should be acknowledged that these are two different ones, but also that they actually use different methods. So the data from 1989 is really looking at specific events where one can calculate how many people were killed, and if over a year there are more than 25 with about the same actors, then they will be included. But the statistics before that is not that detailed. It's more general statistics of how many people died in various conflicts, and then one has spread them over the years. So that's a much rougher way of doing the calculations. And I'm not sure what impact it would have, but I think one shouldn't really draw a straight line because they're not exactly comparable. So I wish you would pay attention to that quick distinction. It's sort of, in a way, academic. Different people have done it and should be acknowledged. But also that it might be that the UCDP data generally are more conservative than the other data, but I don't know. There are definitely differences in the way they are calculated and resourced. I'm not sure that has any real effects on any of your arguments, so it's more a question of acknowledging this. So with that, let me again reiterate, I find this really useful. I find it also interesting that you highlight the issue of colonialism and raise the questions of categories here. Should some of these, for instance, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, be regarded more in line with the category of colonial conflicts? The distinction we do in Uppsala is between territorial and governmental conflicts, and many of those that are defined as territorial in many ways are situations of occupation that people find to be occupations, and that they want to get away from that dependence and that situation. So there are more situations, I think, of occupation or remaining colonial structures that we should attend to. And your report gives me further thoughts and a feeling that we need to attend more closely to this particular problem. So thank you very much. Again, congratulations to this report.
الصوت دكتور سلطان يبدو عندك ميوت.
Sorry. Thank you so much, Peter, for this excellent feedback. As you rightly say, this is a continuous process. I mean, you've been involved in it longest amongst all of us, but we hope that by joining you at this stage from the Arab world, we can work together in the future and continue to elaborate on some of those ideas. I was struck the same way you were by the business of international intervention in the Arab world and how contrasted that is to the rest of the world. We seem to be, when it comes to an Arab problem, the world is trigger happy. They are very quick to respond violently, militarily, and so on. When you compare it to other regions, like in Korea, they just talk and talk and talk for a long time. But for us, it's a quick intervention. So I think that and the many important points you've raised have been noted, and I hope that our participants will come to some of those in the question session. I'd like now to introduce my very good friend Marwan Qabalan, Dr. Marwan came to Doha as the Dean of Political Studies in Syria and Damascus, and he is now a senior researcher at the Center for Arab Studies, and is the person responsible for the strategic studies unit within the Arab Center. Critical studies, is it?
Political studies, yes.
Political studies unit within the Arab Center that produces many really influential reports, including what we term in Arabic تقدير موقف, which reflects on events, but within a historical perspective as well. He also leads the Gulf Studies and the Arabian Peninsula Research Unit. And also he is the convener and responsible for a new master program here at the Doha Institute that focuses on diplomatic and international cooperation studies. Dr. Marwan, thank you very much for joining us. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sultan, and also thank you CHS team, PRIO, and also Uppsala Conflict Data Program for the great efforts. I must say that we don't come across every day something that is really interesting to read, but this is something that I must advise everybody to have a copy of and read carefully through, because I believe that this is one of the most fascinating reports that is dealing mainly with conflicts in the Arab world, spanning across 7 decades from 1946 until 2019. It deals with conflict in the Arab world as a multifaceted, dynamic, and changing phenomena. It shows that conflict in the Arab world over the past 7 decades have taken different shapes and courses, shifting from one form to another. The importance of this report, I believe, is also stems from the fact that it fills a very important gap research in the field. I mean here, it's originating mainly from within the Arab world. We might find things that are studying the Arab world, but from outside the Arab world. This one actually is coming from within the Arab world by researchers who are directly affected by conflicts in the Arab world, and that might make it actually different from other efforts that are being carried in other parts of the world. The importance of this report also stems from the fact that it's using a comparative approach in the study of conflict, and for me it was really fascinating because it demonstrated that the Arab world is no more prone to conflict than other parts of the world, because there is always this the idea about the exceptionality of the Arab world in terms of resisting democratic transition, or in terms of being more violent, or we have more conflicts compared to other parts of the world. This report actually shows that this is not the case. The Arab world is just like every other region of the world. We have our own problems, we have our own conflicts, and we have to deal with them as such. It's also important for me that the report was carefully trying to deal with terminology and trying to define the differences, for example, between wars and conflicts, and of course, many other terms, so that it can study the phenomena in a methodological way and gives us this comprehensive picture about the sort of conflicts that we are having in the Arab world. Dr. Sultan mentioned that probably we are going to have the CHS, PRIO, and maybe others will be having like second stage of this project. And this is where I believe it's really important, because this is what I found lacking in the report. The report, as I said, is mainly focusing on the trajectory and development of conflicts in the Arab world over the past 73 years. It's very important because it helps us understand the dynamic of this conflict, the shift dynamic of these conflicts, how they are transformed from being mainly intrastate into becoming mainly intrastate, especially after the Arab Spring. But equally important, and this is maybe for stage 2 of this project, is maybe to focus or give more space to studying the causes and the origins and the drivers of conflict in the Arab world, because this is really important if we want to reach the stage where we can predict when conflict might happen, where, and if we can prevent that, mitigate it maybe, manage it, and maybe solve it if we can. So studying the origins, the drivers, the causes of conflict in the Arab world is as equally important as understanding the trajectory and the shifting dynamic of conflicts in the Arab world. And here, if I may suggest that if we want to do that, if we want to, perhaps the second stage of this project is going to focus. If I may suggest that if we do that, we may try to study the causes and the drivers of conflict based on maybe first actors. And under that category, we might be talking about man-made drivers or causes. And here we are alluding to the failure of the post-colonial Arab state in dealing with the social economic challenges that have faced them over the past decades and led actually to going from being full functioning state into today we are having so many failing state or fragile state. The failure also, I mean, among these causes of man-made drivers of conflict in the Arab world, we might also include the failure to establish representative government, inclusive politics, national identity, effective public policies that create jobs, provide health and education, and result in prosperity, social justice, and fending against external threats. The other one is natural. Today, it's really important to focus now because as the UN and many other international organizations are actually trying to bring our attention today, that natural disasters are becoming a major source of conflict in many parts of the world, but particularly in the Arab world, because we are like 20% more likely to be affected by climate change more than other regions of the world, and that is according to the UN. And we can give many examples. One of them is of course Syria. One of the key causes of conflict in Syria is climate change. Drought, floods, and fires that are taking place here and there that are forcing thousands, maybe millions of people to leave their home countries are becoming really important causes of conflict in the Arab world. The other level that I might advise in studying the causes of conflict in this region is based on levels that we can study it on the state level, on the regional level, and on the international level. Because as Dr. Sultan has just mentioned, and also I think Peter, we talked about the foreign intervention in this part of the world. So when we talk about domestic level, we can talk about national divisions within states, ethnic, religious, economic, social. Regionally, and this is something also very important to speak about rivalries between different actors in the region that are exacerbating in a way conflicts in many parts of the world. When we talk about Syria or Yemen today or Libya, regional actors are the major drivers that are leading to prolonging conflicts in this part of the world. This is very important. And then we might be talking about the international level, because this increasing competition between the great powers in this region is also leading to prolonged conflict. So we might take the actor-based driver of conflict and the level-based driver of conflict. That might help us actually explain or expand, because I noticed that, of course, I mean, I must say that in page 13 of the English version of the report, you did actually mention that the causes of conflict in that, but I wanted you to expand more on this issue, because this is really important. It's going to be really useful, as I said, in trying to predict and maybe prevent conflicts at some point. There are some issues that are related, technical issue maybe here. Maybe we need to explain why we started by the year 1946, why 1947 or 1948. I think we need to provide an explanation here. And I also noticed that the time frame actually differs from when, and maybe Peter just answered that question. It differs from one part of the study to another. For example, the state-based conflict, the time frame covers 1946 until 2019. But then I see the other parts of the report when we talk about the one-sided violence, for example, or when we talk about the non-state-based conflicts, I see that you cover only 1989 to 2019. So we need also to explain why we are having different time frames for different parts of the report. My last remark actually here is about when we talk about decreasing number of interstate conflicts and increasing number of intrastate conflicts, although I agree with this, but I think we have to be careful about understanding the changing nature of conflict between states. My opinion is that we don't see a decrease in the number of interstate conflicts in the region, but we see a transformation in the way that they are waged. Today, countries are less prone to fight each other directly. So this is why they find a window to fight indirectly through war by proxy, but that doesn't mean that we are having less interstate conflicts in this case. So Saudi Arabia and Iran, they are in confrontation in Syria and in Yemen. Saudi Arabia is directly involved. Iran is Saudi Arabia in a direct way. In Syria, we have exactly the opposite, where Saudi Arabia used to support, for example, Syrian opposition factions, and Iran was directly involved on the ground. So here, actually, the confrontation is indirect between these two countries. So I would advise that maybe we need to also redefine the way we see war, interstate war and intrastate war. And we must, at the end, admit that if there is something that is makes conflicts in the Arab world difficult actually to solve, is that we have all the factors that we mentioned are coming all together. The local, the regional, and the international, making these conflicts very difficult to solve and having a very prolonged course, as we see it, for example, in Syria, as we see it in Libya, and as we see it in Yemen. At the end, I must thank you very much one more time, for the great efforts you put in this report. And as I said at the very beginning, it's fascinating. I advise everybody to read it. The data was really great. And of course, the credit in this case goes to the Uppsala University. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Marwan. Again, I think you're right in that there are many aspects that can be considered, But because we adopted, and again, we're very grateful to Uppsala to have gave us a special access to the data, we adopted what Uppsala has. So a lot of these questions are really answered by what is available. And in a way, by reflecting on what you say, it also highlights what is not available and where are areas where improvements is required, and maybe joint action in the future can actually help address some of those gaps. But I'd like now to pick up on some of the questions from our participants. And please, Siri, Sam, and Muna, feel free to join in responding to those questions. The first two are kind of comments, stroke questions from Ali Al-Zaatari, who is a former UN official, who's now based in Amman, and Dr. Laurent Lambert, who is a lecturer in public policy at the Doha Institute here. Both Ali and Laurent raised the issue of natural phenomena, and in a way reinforcing what Dr. Marwan has said, in that the cause of conflict is not necessarily always triggered by political violence, but there are issues to do with natural resources, water in particular, maybe other aspects related to oil, etc. in our region. Now, I'm happy to ask my colleagues to respond to this. I just wanted to point out again that the data itself, the Uppsala, and maybe Peter can help us out on this, it is particularly focused on political violence or in violence and war. But it is possible, I think it's a good idea to try and look beyond that as we interpret. So Muna, would you like to respond to this? Muna, I cannot see you. I don't know if you're still with us. Muna?
أعتقد أن بالنسبة للنزاعات على الموارد
I think conflicts based on competitiveness on resources, it is a land conflict mainly, and I believe Dr. Peter and Dr. Asiri maybe could correct me if I was wrong in my assessment. They fall under the category of territorial or land. Dr. Asiri, do you agree with this premise?
The Uppsala data that we work with, they do not code causes of conflict. That is something we often do sort of when we do the research, when we use data. And I have worked with natural resources and conflict for years. So I think that's a very useful and valid topic to look at. But I think that is sort of the analysis part of this. And then we need to go in and look at more of the causes of each of the conflicts. And this is work I have done previously, and I think it would be useful to do this. We could do it specifically for the Arab region as well. But it's not data that is there out there right now, but it's definitely an interesting topic.
Thank you very much, Siri. Peter, did you want to say something?
Yeah, let me just reiterate just what Siri said. I mean, what this is really conflict data, and we would need to complement that with data on resources, etc., in order to answer some of those questions. And in one of the graphs that you saw, there were the localities where conflicts do take place. And they provide a very interesting starting point. What kind of localities are these? Are these sort of places where there are interesting minerals or important trading routes, etc., etc.? So that could be an inroad to go further. But it is definitely so that what we have here are conflicts with that particular definition. And then all the other categorizations and so on is what we need to do with the help of other thinking and with other resources.
Fantastic. So it's again reinforcing the idea that this is just gives you an indication, a direction, and then it is for the individual researchers to explore based on these trends that you see. You can explore and understand better how those trends have been made, or how did they come to exist. I have another question here from Beata Paragi. Beata's question is about community-based conflict, and she's basically asking, to what extent does the database and the report reflect the religious affiliation of various communities when talking about community-based, or do we just ignore it? Anyone would like to respond to this?
I can say something. So the community-based conflict could be religiously based. So it could be groups that are defined to have a religious identity, but it's not coded to be religious conflicts. Just as the case with natural resources, these data do not provide the causes of conflict, but rather just the fact that there is a cause and certain groups are fighting. So community-based conflicts could be based on religion, it could be based on ethnicity, it could be based on region. But again, that is something that we would need to explore specifically afterwards. I don't know if Peter might have additional thoughts on that.
No, that's absolutely correct. And there are some projects, for instance, by Isaac Svensson, who has tried to identify, are there religious motivated groups involved? Are there religious issues that are concerned, or is one targeting religious targets, etc., in order to get to this question? And so that's another way in which this can be used for further research.
Great, thank you so much. As you can appreciate, I think religion in our part of the world is central to a lot of our happenings. Okay, I will now move to some of the participants, and I have Paula Manduca is wanting to ask a question. Paula.
Hello, I'm from Italy. No, my questions were more at the root of the data, actually. I am a scientist. I'm very much interested in understanding how the data were collected. There is a questionnaire, there is a format, there is who are the sources. And the second aspect that I am interested in, always in a methodological aspect in a way, is how this data can be correlated actually, to the dimension of populations that are involved. And therefore, the weight in, the whole graph of a place where there is a conflict that kills, say, 50% of the people, but it's a small place, is different, of course, that if you kill the same number of people in a population that is 100 times bigger. And that because my take of the data essentially is that you produced a sort of geospatial map, which would be nice to see also, enlarged for the areas, which can be of great interest if also these factors were input.
Yes.
And also the element of who is the one that is waging war when there are actually really wars or violent occupations, and the differences of the actors.
Yes, thank you very much, Paula. I'll take another question. We'll come back to this in a minute, but it's a very important point, the proportionality. What is the proportion of the impact on society? And it is actually related to some other points raised by others about how we define the impact of conflict. Do we actually only look at the number of deaths? And this is a question by Amal Karaki. Or do we also look at the economic impact of the conflict and the social impact of the conflict? Any of my colleagues would like to respond to this point?
So I can say a few words about it. So I think
Please,
Paula, I think your question about population effect is really interesting. And in fact, I'm working on a different project that we had done for Save the Children for a long while, where we look at the impact on children. But when we also look at the impact of children, we look at the impact of the population as well. So what we do is to calculate the size of population that is affected by conflict by using these geopoints or conflict events and looking at how many people live close to it. And I think we have a very good example in the Arab world, where we see Syria, for example, is totally covered by conflict events, and the entire population is obviously affected. But when you look at Yemen, it's only the southwestern part which is affected, and it looks like it's only half the country. But in fact, we know that most of the population live in this area, and 90% of the population is affected. So I think this sort of human security issue is really important, and that is certainly something we could look more into as well about the population. When it comes to economic consequences, there is done quite a lot of research on this. There is a report by some other colleagues among Scott Gates, where they look at the consequences of conflict. So there certainly are research on this, even though we do not include that in this specific report. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Siri. Again, to emphasize that this report, it gives you the trends that hopefully will encourage researchers to pick up on those questions and go in more depth. But also in the coming years, hopefully as we produce maybe in a couple of years a follow-up report, maybe in our interpretation, we can give slightly more attention to some of those issues that have been raised today. I'd like now to move on to Mohammed. Sorry, Mohammed, I cannot read your family name here. Al-Rawali, Mohammed Al-Rawali.
Yeah.
Please introduce yourself and very quickly give the question. Yeah.
So Mohammed Al-Rawali, I'm PhD researcher. My question is, when you see the figure number 30, like, you know, just like, you know, a question that has arisen in my mind, like, have you, my question to all of you, have you compared you do see the violent based, let's say, countries, or non-states country or stable country, or one side, whatever. So have you compared these kind of places that had or faced violence with stable countries that share the same maybe ground, the same common things? The second question, when we talk about the Arab world, of course, like now in our nowadays, it's not living, like, you know, excluded from the other, let's say, world. Then we are talking, like, you know, about some concepts such as modernity. How this kind of, let's say, idea has been affected by concepts such as modernity, or, like, you know, something else. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mohammed. I think this question maybe is better to go to Peter with. Sorry to put you on the spot, but being the man who set it all up.
Yeah. Thank you. And that means I can also respond to Paula's question about the resources, because what we use here are entirely public resources. So there is no intelligence operations or anything like that, and all the sources can be, you know, found. And basically you can say it's media sources, it's researchers, colleagues that have written on this, it's non-governmental organizations, it's governmental organizations, all those kind of data that are available. But we are not, I actually is not very impressed by secret agencies and the way they collect information. I think we can do better. And but we are transparent about what we do, and I think that makes us better, because it can all be scrutinized. Mohammed's question about comparisons, definitely that's what you do with a statistical study, so to say. You compare a whole set of countries, and where some have these characteristics of conflict and some others do not have a conflict. That's sort of a statistical process, but you can also do it as a comparative conflict analysis. You can compare countries in the Arab world which have not seen many open conflicts with those that have, and see how comparable is it, and discuss it. So that's a methodological issue, and it's all doable, and that's, so to say, the next stage in what we are doing. Then I'm not sure about your question about modernity, how you meant it, but maybe some others can pick up on that issue. I mean, we are all living in modernity in some sense. So I'm not sure really how you think that could be part of it. If you with that mean modern technology, like we are working on right now, that's really very interesting in itself. Social media, etc., and that's importance for conflict or for peace. There are many things there which are part of the modern society, so to say. But these are my first quick reactions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. It may be interesting to reflect a little bit on the advances in media and in social media and its role in reporting. I mean, now in the world of media, real life, real-time reporting by individuals has become an important aspect of the news we get, whether you're following what's going on in Kabul today, in Syria before that, and so on. And as an academic community, whether that kind of reporting can play a role in gathering our data, even if it was just to give us a trend or an idea of what is going on, would be interesting, I think, to explore in a more detail in the future. But thank you, Mohammed, for your question. And we're running out of time, but there are a few other questions. If you allow me, I'm gonna just pick on one or two and see if we can we'll be fast enough to respond to them. Muhammad Kardash is asking a question. It's related to what Peter has observed early on to do with internationalization of civil wars and intervention in the Arab world from outside. Does the trend shed the trends that we've put together in this world, does it actually shed any light on the motives of that intervention? Or are we just basically reporting that there are greater disproportionate intervention in the Arab world than the rest of the world? Sam, are you with us? Would you like to respond to that? I cannot hear Sam. Siri or Mona?
So I think in the report we're only reporting sort of the trends, but I think Dr. Marawan had made some really good points about being too quick maybe in the Arab world, that there's a bit of focus on it, but to further, we need further work to actually identify why we see this trend. And I think what we do see in the trend is that this peak of internationalized civil war comes sort of together with the increase of IS conflict as well. So I think there certainly is maybe some sort of interaction there, that IS is becoming such a big international problem. It's not an organization that only works in one country or one region. It's actually spreading all over the world. So it is an international problem, but this sort of needs to be further looked into, how that actually affects how other countries react to it. Yeah.
Very interesting.
May I add something? I mean, to what Siri has just said about that question?
Sure, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yes. I think if the question was about why we have like more internationalized civil war in this part of the world than other regions, I don't know, but I have the feeling that because we have more divided society in this part of the world, and we have also more repressive governments, and we have more stakes by foreign governments in the civil conflicts. The concerning division within countries when you have divided societies, so more likely that divided communities will seek assistance and aid from external patrons. So this is why foreign governments are invited sometimes to support one side against the other, and this applies to Syria, Yemen, Libya, and if you have also a less representative government, more authoritarian government, I mean, they are more likely to depend on foreign backing. So usually the backer will just jump in order to support these governments, and also the last one that I mentioned is that because we have a very tense competition between regional and international powers, so they fear that any outcome of a conflict, of a given conflict, would go against their interests. So they would intervene actually in order to prevent their rivals from taking advantage, or actually they might also be encouraged to intervene in order to serve their own interests. So there are so many actual reasons of why we are considered to be like the soft belly of the world, where if we have a problem, so everybody would jump in and try actually to either serve his own interest or prevent the rivals from serving their own interests. Well, that's of course what I said about divided societies and people inviting foreign patrons in order to get in and try to help them in these conflicts. So I don't know if I answered the question.
Thank you very much, Marwan. And I convey also a special thank you from Katerina Matoy, who seems to send an appreciation for your previous comments. Muna, do you want to come in on the subject?
عفواً فقط لدي تعقيب إضافي regarding the question about.
You need to stick either Arabic or English.
Regarding the question about comparing the international or third-party involvement in civil wars in Arab region compared to the global trends. Actually, the report presents two figures, figure number 6 and figure number 13. Figure number 6 is on the Arab trends and 13 for the global trends. We can compare the two figures together to show how it differentiates from the global trends. However, it doesn't show the trends on the regions level. So maybe we will consider this in the next version of the report. But we can see clearly that the internationalized civil wars in the Arab world is much more than the global trend. And even in the figure for the global trends, most of this gray area, which presents the internationalized civil wars, is actually came from the Arab world interventions. I mean, third-party interventions in Arab world conflicts.
Thank you very much. I mean, some would argue because of the strategic importance of the Arab world, it kind of
oil and gas. And the wealth, oil and gas also are important factors.
Yes, it invites intervention, but also since the end of the Cold War and the way Islam, political Islam, has been portrayed as the potential enemy of the West, I think it has invited also a lot of attention and intervention in our region. I'm afraid we've run out of time. We're 10 minutes behind schedule. And I would like to thank you all for taking the time to be part of this fantastic session. I really think this is, I hope it will be the beginning of further collaboration into the years to come. It's such an honor to be working with the most established data set in the world on issues of conflict, with some of fresh ideas from within our context, to be asking those questions, to be reflecting on them directly. I hope that this discussion, which will be available online, will also encourage a lot of our researchers in the Arab world to roll their sleeves up and engage. You know, the database will not bite, or it does, it presents you with the trend, the view of what is thought the available data has portrayed, and it is up to us to take it and do it, you know, put it together, think about it, reflect, and come up with the proper understanding of causes, why conflict is so much spread in our region, what can we do about it? And there are many, many areas. I think some of them were raised by Peter and Marwan, but also by other colleagues and those who asked the questions that should be looked at in terms of economic impact on us, the economic cost of conflict, the social cost of conflict in our region. In the early version of this report, we have actually looked into the armament industry. We thought it would be very interesting to see the relation between how much we spend, and we spend a lot of money in the Arab world on building up arms and prepare for war, and much more than we do to prepare for peace. And I think it would be very interesting maybe to follow up with some focus studies on some of these areas. And again, working with PRIO and Uppsala is such a great opportunity. I would like to thank you all for your participation. Henrik, thank you very much for your support and for allowing us this great opportunity. Siri, Muna, and Sam for being such a wonderful team, research team on this report. Thank you, Peter and Marwan, for acting as discussants. I hope we can continue our discussion. And a warm thank you for those who are behind the scene. The translators, as always, have done a great job. And it is the beginning of linking us to you. Language is very, very important. So thank you for your effort. Thank you, Ibrahim, Rand, Mu'mina, and the rest of the team here for working tirelessly for this exercise. Again, I would like also just to acknowledge those colleagues who have been really key by providing the peer review to the report. This report has received quite critical revisions a number of times. And I hope that in the next report, we will be able to do it even faster and little by little maybe catch up with the way the Uppsala database works in terms of releasing its data year on year so that the gap is not enormous. Now we are discussing data from 2019. We're already into 2021, edging onto 2022. But inshallah, next time we'll be able to do it faster. So thank you all for your contributions and have a great evening. Good day to everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.
Shukran.